Good morning and good afternoon for you East Coasters. Welcome so much. We're excited to have this webinar today. Before we begin and while we're waiting for people to join the session, I want to give a quick reminder for those of you who are joining us for the first time that we cannot see or hear you, but hopefully you can see and hear us. So if you can't for some reason, go ahead and throw a note in the chat feature so that we can make sure that we can make this work for everybody. But we're really excited to have this session today. We don't typically do a deck for our webinars, but we feel like this is such an important topic that we wanted to cover and make sure everybody is able to fully absorb the information that we're talking about today. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Megan Strout. I am the founder and CEO of TAC Advisors. We help organizations with hiring, onboarding, and training chiefs of staff, executive assistants, personal assistants, really these force multipliers that we're going to talk about today. And I'm joined by Hallie Warner, who is the CEO of the founder and the force multiplier. Hallie, can you share with us a little bit about you and your company and what it is that you do?
Sure, yeah. So for the past almost 15 years or so, I've been either in an executive assistant or a chief of staff role, most recently as a chief of staff. About 6 months ago or so, I officially became the owner of the founder and the force multiplier after working with that company for about 5 years in a couple of different capacities. But the founder and force multiplier provides coaching and training and some consulting for executive assistants, aspiring chiefs of staff, for these force multiplier positions, like Megan was just talking about, as well as for the founders and leaders. Oftentimes we work with entrepreneurs as well to make sure that we teach them both how to find each other and then how to have really great strategic partnerships, hopefully long-term partnerships.
Amazing. And it's been so great because Hallie and I have actually had the opportunity to work on roles with executives and force multipliers in the past. And so this is a topic that comes up pretty regularly for us. In fact, this conversation I've had probably twice in the past week with prospective clients who are looking to hire for force multiplier for the first time. So we're really excited to talk about this today. And we basically wanted to put together sort of three key things that we wanted to chat about during this webinar. And today it's about, how do you know it's time to hire a force multiplier? This is a conversation I have all the time with clients who are just starting to think about hiring some type of support. So we're going to break that down today. We're going to talk about aligning on skills and vision before you make the hire. And I think this is probably the biggest area of um, point of failure for a lot of companies where they think they need to hire somebody. They just put together a job description without being really thoughtful about the type of person, the skill set, the size and stage of their company, where they're going, where they're growing. They make a hire and then it's not the right fit for where they are at their life and business stage. So we're going to break that down. And then the last piece, which is arguably the most important. All three of these are very important, but the part that you really specialize in, Hallie, and are great is about that building that trust and transparency and continuing to invest in this relationship because once you make this hire, it's not like poof, it magically happens and everybody works great together. Like it is a relationship that is built over time on both sides, putting in the time and the effort to make it work. Um, so, Hallie, you put this together. Tell me a little bit about when you're talking to these founders and you're talking to executives that are looking to hire. What are these sort of pain points or these what I call like the impetus for deciding to make this type of hire within their team or within their company?
Yeah, it's a couple of different things. I would say the top thing is that they're not spending time in their 20%. So if you're familiar with the Pareto principle, it's the 80-20 rule that 20% of your activity should be producing 80% of your results. So I always, when I'm talking to anyone in force multipliers or leaders, making sure we're really getting very clear on what that 20% looks like. And for leaders, it's oftentimes casting the vision, it's leading the team, it's removing roadblocks, providing clarity, focus, and direction for the team. And then sometimes if they're still like in the production side of their role, so they might be doing the sales function of their role as well, business development, that sort of thing. If it's if they're working on stuff outside of those pieces of the business, that to me is a sign that they need a force multiplier. They need an assistant who's going to help them manage all of the other things that go into running a business, into leading an organization. And I think that that happens fairly quickly for founders. They're doing everything, right? And entrepreneurs are doing everything. So I think the first hire for any founder or entrepreneur is an assistant, and I've is an executive assistant. So a couple other signs might be that it's taking them a lot longer to achieve the results that they're looking for, or they're not achieving the results at all.
Mhm.
Um, they might be spending way too much time in that day-to-day minutia of these non-revenue generating activities, like I was just mentioning. Sometimes it's just that they have so many inquiries coming their way and they're not able to act on opportunities, or they're not able to organize, execute, act on the ideas that they have, or act on the opportunities that are coming their way. To me, that's also a sign that an assistant might be needed.
I think the thing that when I was going through this list, I was like, oh my God, for me as somebody who is an obliger, I'm constantly caring for and thinking about everybody else. The number one thing that was a huge improvement for me when I brought on my first EA is just having somebody to help take away a lot of the tasks that I was doing so I could actually prioritize my mental and physical health. Because it's
Mm,
so easy when you're an executive, you're pulling 12, 14 plus hour days. I mean, 6, 7 days a week, especially when it's the early days of your company.
mm,
And it's really, really hard to do that and also have any type of work life integration or like prioritize your health. And so having somebody else who's looking out on that for you, especially on like an executive personal assistant level, that's helping create that time, that's actually making those appointments for you, that is taking away a lot of the other tasks that you're working on so you can prioritize your health. That was one of the things that really spoke to me that I remember was a huge improvement almost immediately when I first made my hire.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I always say too that sometimes it's just that you don't want to go it alone. It can be as simple as that. Like you want a partner to yes, to take on that 80%, right? They're going to complement the work that you do, but leadership is lonely, and being an entrepreneur and a founder can be quite lonely. And so having that counterpart to balance the workload, to be bouncing ideas off of, to act as a thought partner for you. It's sometimes it's just as simple as that. You want another team member to help build your company.
Absolutely. So one of the things I think is important, and so we talked a little bit about the when, and I know you mentioned you think that it should be the first hire. I think it depends, right? Like I worked with a lot of founders, especially if they're founders that are going to be somewhat solopreneurs for a while or aren't going to build a team for a while, that I think it's incredibly helpful to have this person be the first hire.
Mhm.
Um, I think there's what I've seen that's a little bit different with some of my other companies that I work with and clients that are, venture firms, they're startups, they're planning on hiring employees pretty quickly. Is that it's really helpful to have this person that's like the first G&A hire, usually within the first like 5 to 10 employees, but maybe it's not the first hire. It totally depends. You have to balance it out. You might actually need somebody who can build the product first, and so that's an engineering hire. You need another co-founder. You need somebody who's doing product, and then you're bringing somebody else on, or on the venture side, like it might be like a couple other investors first, and you have to raise your fund before you can bring on somebody. So it totally just depends. But I think having somebody within the first 5 to 10 employees is probably going to make your life and your business grow exponentially faster and make your job and life a lot more enjoyable.
I
so
agree.
so one of the things though that we would talk about is getting really clear on the what is it that you need to hire, what level of support. And we're going to break down a little bit in a second about like the different types of force multipliers because they come in all different shapes and sizes. But getting really clear on the what first before the who. And so one of the things that we always do at TAC whenever we have somebody who comes to us who thinks they're ready to make this hire is we do an extensive deep dive into the scope of what their company is and what their biggest pain points are so that we can then make recommendations on the who, because even a seed or series A company doesn't necessarily need the same level of person. It depends on what the landscape of their team is. So, one of the things that we really dig, and we try to do some of this information like research and ahead of time. We have Crunchbase. So we look up the company, we look up their funding, we, try to understand that. There's a lot of information though. If you're not a company that's venture backed, we can't get that information, so we, some of this we have to ask, but like understanding, what is the size and stage of your company? Typically speaking, if you're, very early stage, you're venture backed, you are like seed, you need somebody who's truly a generalist who has a breadth of experience because they're going to be wearing the recruiting coordinator hat, the office manager hat if you're physically in an office space, or the operations hat if you don't have somebody who's already doing operations. You're going to need somebody who can do the EA work. You'll probably even maybe need them to help do some PA work for you. Like there's just a lot of experience that this person's going to touch versus a later stage company or a public company or a much more established company that has all these teams in place. And so then they're going to go much deeper into their role and they're going to be just focused on supporting you. And if it's an EA, it's going to deep, strategic EA work. Or if it's a chief of staff, you'll probably already have an EA on a later stage company. And then the two of them will be partnering for really optimizing your time. So it's just a little bit different. Same thing with like type of funding, right? There are a lot of founders, including myself, who bootstrapped our company. So what we're going to be looking for is going to be very different from a company that just got, $10 million in venture funding. Like it's just a very different financial situation. Same thing with, I work with a lot of venture firms, and one of the first things I ask if it's not information that I can find publicly available is, how much are you managing? How much do you have in assets under management? Because what you are looking for, if you have, 100 million in assets under management versus 1 billion in assets under management, are two very different things, right? Your purview, the way you're spending your time as an investor is going to be very, very different when you're 100 million versus 1 billion. Far as like industries go, every company has a different, business rhythm. There's a different rhythm of the business, right? And so, somebody who is supporting a solopreneur, somebody who's going to keep their team very tiny, is going to need somebody who's used to working in a very agile environment, in a very startup environment, versus somebody who's, if you're working at like a public company, a public tech company, a Fortune 500 company, there are tools and systems and processes and red tape for everything. And some people thrive in that environment and some people do not thrive in that environment. Some people find that incredibly frustrating. And so depending on what the size and stage of your company is, like you have to think about that too, of what type of person is going to feel fulfilled in that environment. It's not necessarily that they can't do well or they can't be adaptable, but it's like, is this type of company and environment going to bring you joy? Because there's some very thrilling things that come along with being in an early stage startup. And there's also a lot of instability in an early stage startup. But there's a lot of typically autonomy and opportunity to take on more projects, but it's not going to necessarily be the cushiest job that you've ever had. So these are all things to think about. And then as far as thinking about the team, and I was just chatting with one of my venture clients about this past week. They're making this is effectively their first G&A hire. They don't have a COO of their venture firm. They don't have anybody else. This is going to be the sole person that is going to be running this other than these two investors. So I'm like, all right, you probably need then for this hire to have venture experience because you're not going to have time to teach them. It's not like they're going to be coming in and learning from a COO or a chief administrative officer getting that guidance. So who's going to teach them that if they don't already know the lingo, the key players, the rhythm of the business? So, who exists on the team? Is there anybody else on the team yet? Do you already have a recruiting coordinator that's going to be doing recruiting coordination? No, you're planning to scale and add another 20 people this year to your team, then you probably should have somebody who's touched recruiting at some point in their career, because there is an art and a skill to this, right? And so these are all the kind of factors that you have to think about. Okay, so I think another question that I love, and I'm curious if you ever asked this, Hallie, is have they ever had somebody that's been a force multiplier before? I love this question.
Mhm.
Do you talk when you're coaching and consulting people? Is this something that you talk about kind of in the early stage?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I will say they usually offer up that information and tell me about all the reasons why it hasn't worked previously. So but that's great information. There's a lot of, I mean, right, and then you start asking more questions, but there's a lot of good information about what didn't work,
Yeah.
and why it didn't work, and how we can make that different the next time.
Do you see any common threads when people are sharing with you why it didn't work before?
Yeah, sometimes I would say there's two that come to mind right away. One is that they usually rushed the hiring process, or they rushed it, and therefore were all of the things you just talked about, they hadn't considered any of those points. And so they were making that hire out of pain rather than really being thoughtful about that hire. So ultimately it wasn't the right fit. And so it was almost doomed to fail from the beginning. And then I would say the second piece is if maybe they had done that, and usually it doesn't work, because they are not spending the necessary time together in order to build a partnership, to understand how to communicate, to teach each other how to think and work best together, to build that trust, to understand the business. All it's the time, it's the time together, in my opinion, in the communication.
Yeah, we're going to talk about all that towards the end of the session. So yeah, so I mean, I see a lot of similar common threads. I always like to know, it's helpful to know what didn't work, and it's also helpful to know what did. Because I have worked with executives who have had successful partnerships, but it's not necessarily, there are certain qualities about people that work really well for them, but then also, again, going back to, well, when did they have this partnership? Was this 5 years ago, 10 years ago? What was the size and stage of your business back then? And oh, now you haven't had somebody in 5 years. All right, well, it's going to look different this time. We can find somebody with similar qualities, similar background or skills, but it's not going to be like a perfect fit right off the bat. Again, you have to spend that time getting to know them. You have to like reintegrate somebody into your work and your work life. You got to put in that time. But that, yeah, I think this is like such an important question that people often forget. I think talking about what your communication style looks like and how you plan on sharing and spending that time with somebody on a daily or weekly basis is really key. I know we're going to talk a little bit about the difference, later, of like what a one-on-one is versus a sync, how often you should be connecting with people. And I know we're also going to talk a little bit about like somebody who's really great in a force multiplier role is somebody who can adapt to your work style. Maybe verbal communication isn't your favorite thing to do. Like, we can adapt to that. But are you somebody who just primarily is going to be texting or slacking or sending messages on Teams all day? That's helpful to know, right? Because we want to find somebody who is happy to and will adjust to that being your primary mode of communication. Doesn't mean you don't have to communicate with them at all. That's the opposite of what we're saying. You still have to communicate with them, but how do you want to connect? Is it primarily asynchronously? Is it going to be live? I know for me, I'm the kind of person that does best when I actually get to talk through things with my force multiplier. That's how my brain works. I actually find it incredibly exhausting and daunting to constantly be texting or slacking. Like, I'd rather just pick up the phone or do a quick huddle or a Zoom and talk through things. But these are things that I think executives need to talk about and consider. Um, the other thing to consider is where this person's located. Some people do much better with somebody directly sitting next to them or side by side or having that FaceTime versus if they want somebody who's remote, there are pros and cons to both. A perk of somebody who's fully remote is that the compensation is significantly less, right? Because you have a much larger pool and people have different costs of living. But if you're somebody who like just wants to be able to talk to somebody and like an idea pops into your head and you just want to tell somebody who's sitting right next to you because that's how you work best. All right, well then there's a trade-off there, right? And then I think the last thing is if there's personal support, like what does your life stage look like? As a founder, as an entrepreneur, do you have a life partner? Do you have children? Do you have parents that you're caring for? I've seen all of these things. And if you do have personal support and this is something that you need to have help with, well, the personal support now either needs to be an individual person or you need to be able to prepare for these personal tasks taking away from some of the business tasks that this person is doing because there are only so many hours in the day. And if they're working on your personal stuff, that takes away from the time that they're working on your business stuff. And so again, like the more your business grows and your life grows, you're either going to have that role's going to have to bifurcate, right? And so I think that's something else that's incredibly important. Anything else you'd add to that, Hallie?
No, I think you covered that.
Okay, cool. Um, awesome. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about career stages? This is an image that you shared
Yeah.
with me that I'm like, I'm a visual person and I just love it. I think I'm like, yes, Hallie, thank you.
Yeah.
How would you break down this image a little bit?
Yeah, so when we were talking about understanding right the stages of your business, are you bootstrapping? Do you have a ton of funding? Like understanding where someone is also on their career stage is oftentimes going to dictate what their salary range is. So that's something that we want to keep in mind. Potential talent is usually going to be your least expensive talent. They're unproven. They may have worked, a little, maybe a year or two, but they haven't yet done the role that you're hiring for. So you don't exactly know what you're taking a big risk. You're taking a big risk, but you're not making a lot of a monetary investment into that individual. And then it goes up from there. So then you have emerging talent. They have done a similar role previously, but maybe they haven't been an EA for a VC firm, but they've been an EA somewhere else. Proven talent, of course, in this example would be somebody who's been an EA for many, many years at the specific company at the specific type of company that you're hiring somebody for. They are talent, they have a track record, they have a history of success in that particular role. And of course, they're also going to be the most expensive. Um, yes, you want to keep in mind the investment for this particular type of talent. It doesn't mean that these individuals aren't talent. They're all talent. They're just different levels of talent and they're at different stages of their career. So it's the monetary investment. But the other thing I think is worth considering is you as the leader and your leadership style. So taking the investment out of the equation, there are simply some leaders who do not do, and this is why it's so important to know yourself as a leader. There are some leaders who don't do well with the potential or emerging talent because they don't have, for whatever reason, the desire to or the bandwidth to do coaching, training to bring them up to where they need to be to function well in the role. Conversely, there are some leaders who love, like for many years, probably the first like 10 years or so that Adam and I worked together, Adam's my former executive, we always were hiring emerging talent because we loved one, the investment for emerging talent, but also that we got to really coach them up to where we wanted them to be within our organization. Towards the end of, working together, we were like, we're only hiring proven talent because we didn't have the bandwidth or the need to necessarily be doing all of that coaching and training for staff. So that's something to consider as well, I think.
I think everything you said is just so on point and so key that and this is a conversation that I have with executives going back to that thing I mentioned before is has this person had a force multiplier before?
Right.
You and Adam had many force multipliers over the course of your 13 plus year career
Mm-hmm.
together, partnership together. And the early stage of where you were and where your business was, you had the time, you had the energy, you had the desire to hire potential talent and to train them and coach them up into the role. And then in the later years of you like having built at that point multiple businesses and your
Mhm.
time being much more restricted, you're like, I just need somebody who's plug and play.
Yeah.
And so, and that's very normal. That's very common. And so I think again, knowing who you are as a leader and knowing where you are in your personal life stage. I've seen this with many executives that I have worked with. It's okay that your work style and your life stage have changed if you need now proven talent when you previously were able to get by with potential and have and develop and invest in them and grow. So I think that's awesome. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the typical qualities of like, because you mentioned all of these are talent.
Yes.
So it does.
Yeah.
So what do you consider talent versus like non-talent? And like, what are the key kind of differentiators? Because it's not necessarily about experience.
Correct. I think it's so much more about it's about behavior. I think, and you guys talk about attack about attitude, and I talk a lot about it just like behavior and drive. And that for me, it's like that ambition and desire to learn and grow and being growth minded. So a couple of examples of, and you can think when I go through some of these, you can think about individuals you've worked with previously or you've had on your team that kind of lean towards one or the other. And you typically know when sometimes you can't quite put your finger on it, why they might not be working or why it might not be the right fit. And sometimes it tends to be not necessarily lack of skill, but the sort of lack of the attitude or the behavioral fit. A couple things like the non-talent has to be pushed to want answers versus talent who is bringing you solutions before you even knew you had a problem. Non-talent, requires again you to push them. They're very reactive. They're kind of sitting back and waiting to be asked to do something, kind of this order taker versus talent who knows exactly what they want and they're either actively searching or if they don't know what they want, they're actively searching for it, or if they know exactly what they want and they are going towards it to achieve that goal. I think talent is always pushing you. You're not always pushing talent, right? Talent pushes you, challenges your thinking. And this can be in any role, it's not just a force multiplier role. Um, Big one too, non-talent takes your energy away. You feel drained after an interaction with them versus talent who is giving you energy, is helping to, just lifts you up, makes you feel a bit more inspired, takes away your stress. But that takes and gives energy, I think is a big one.
I love all of these. We call it, and this is something I learned in the early years of working in hospitality, like hire for talent, train for skill. And so I love that saying so much that like we developed a recruiting package for this attack for our early stage clients who maybe can't afford the proven talent. They have the budget more so for the developing talent. But they still want, like, they need somebody who has that hustle and that drive and that rigor, who
Hmm.
wants to learn, but maybe they don't, like the executive doesn't have the skills or understanding on how to develop that. And so we then pair like recruiting and finding that type of developing talent, and then we train them and develop them into the role in partnership with the exec to give that extra support. So I think that's great. But same thing. I think about and all the people that I've worked with over the years. This isn't just for it's at all for force multipliers. It's for every role. It is
Right.
for salespeople. It is for this drive, this hustle, this person who's going to bring you ideas and solutions. It doesn't mean that they're going to be problematic and say, hey, this is broken. They are absolutely going to point out when something is broken, but they're going to be like, hey, this is broken. Can we try fixing it one of these three different ways, right? They're solutions
Hmm.
oriented. They're like constantly thinking of ways to improve the company and improve your life. So I think this is also just like a really awesome framework.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so let's talk about the who now. So we talked about the what, right? We want talent that is either potential, emerging, or proven. You have to figure out what that looks like as a leader and kind of your work style, your bandwidth, what's right for your company and size and stage. And so now you need to talk about the who. And I think this is something that I'm very passionate about talking about leveling because I think a lot of people are mistitled And I think that it's a very hot topic right now, especially with a lot of these roles being taken overseas. And there's I think a huge difference and huge delta in experience and what the position is. And so I think it's important for us to take a moment to talk about this. So if we think back to that, proven, that little framework or that whatever we call it scale that you had talked about, sort of that bottom quadrant, if you were hiring for talent, not for non-talent, but we talk somebody who is talent, who is in the potential, so they're unproven talent, don't have the experience, or maybe a couple years of professional experience, they're probably sitting at more of like an administrative coordinator or administrative assistant, or in a lot of companies that I work with, if there's a physical in-office component, they're hiring this person as a receptionist or a front office coordinator, right? So they're just kind of starting out in their career. They need a lot of direction and guidance. If they're given direction and guidance and they're a talent, they can then operate based off of preferences and information that you have given them. They can, again, like for if it's an EA role, they can, schedule meetings. You give them directives on this is how I want my meeting scheduled. Here's how I want the calendar invite to look. Here's, the information that needs to be included, but they may not yet totally understand the business. So they're not going to necessarily know the priority of or the content of the meetings unless directed to it by their executive, right? These kind of unproven talent in the beginning, like they're still getting their footing. It's like a baby who's starting to learn how to walk, right? Like they're kind of wobbly a little bit. They're like holding on to things as they're afraid that they're going to make a mistake. So they're not necessarily going to be comfortable asking for help. And so they're going to need you to proactively follow up with them and say, hey, like, let's go through the list of things we have to do. Let's talk about what tasks need to be prioritized, what things need to be delegated, right? Like they're really looking to you for guidance. These are roles and tasks that, depending on if you're a totally remote workforce, it may be worth outsourcing these positions to a fully virtual assistant or even to a company abroad, unless you need somebody on site for these office coordinator, reception, like in-person tasks. So this is where, typically speaking, when a company comes to me at TAC, if we work on these roles, it's because this is an in-office role. This isn't an office 5 days a week. They're being the office coordinator, they're being the office manager. So there's really, you need that physical in-person component. So that's kind of where we see with that unproven talent, developing assistant, titling, leveling, administrative coordinator, office coordinator. Hallie, what do you think about this? Anything else that you would add?
No, I think you definitely nailed the developing assistant. And I will say it's a pretty common question. I'm sure you get it too. I was talking to a group of integrators, so various executives, and they said, "Can I hire my EA? Can they be a virtual assistant?" And which is a common question, right? And I said, "Okay, well," and then you go into this whole series of questions. It depends because there's so many variables. What does a virtual assistant mean? We're all kind of virtual these days, but oftentimes what they mean is, can I hire a 10-hour a week or a 20-hour a week um, overseas or outsourced assistant who maybe has 20 other clients or 10 other clients they're working with, which may or may not work depending on the situation.
So then that next level in that hierarchy or the scale is that emerging talent. So somebody who is talent with a similar track record, but maybe they're not in the same industry. And so this is where I really see like that executive assistant title, somebody who is an advanced assistant, that they know how to do this job, right? They have their sea legs under them. They understand like content and meetings. They are starting to understand like the rhythm of the business, but they're still going to need regular instruction and guidance, right? Especially if they're transitioning into a new industry, like they're going to need some time understanding the patterns and what the priorities and the key contacts are. So they're just going to need a little bit more of that support. They're working sort of cross-functionally with teams. They're working very collaboratively. So, this is sort of that like middle tier. And then I think that last kind of career is like a senior executive assistant, or now we're starting to see people be in these executive business partner titles or administrative business partner titles. And so this is somebody who needs like little to no instruction from their execs on their day-to-day work. They're able to see between the line. They're the ones who already are familiar with the business and are going to come in. And honestly, a lot of them are the ones that are have seen beyond the trees at this point, and they're giving you direction and like making suggestions on how to think about things that maybe you haven't even seen before on your team. And they're really great with building these, cross-functional relationships. They're in your meetings, they're taking notes, they're following up on action items. They're really driving the business forward. And then this last piece, which I'll let you talk about, is this expert, Hallie, which is somebody who is sort of this director of administration, administrative chief of staff, executive operations. It's really where you sort of shifted into in the majority of the role when you were in your last position. And so from your perspective, like tell me a little bit more about what you think are these sort of like expert or like force multiplier individuals.
Yeah, I think I mean, again, I always feel like there's so many nuances depending on the size and the scope of the company and the leader that you work with. But in this expert space, I will say that for me, at least when I moved into the chief of staff role, it became it's far less administrative. It was very much forward looking, project oriented, very much that strategic partner, almost like a co-CEO sometimes to the CEO, where we were collaborating on projects. Sometimes I would come up with the idea, sometimes he would come up with the idea, and then we were just executing based off of our strengths. But still, it was always, again, I always go back to the word partnership. I probably say it too often, but it is, to me, it's just so much about this partnership where it's one role. And I really believe this, that you're doing one role, you just happen to be doing two different parts of it. The expert also, and I don't know what you're seeing, but oftentimes there would be another admin or another assistant as part of that team. So in my case, there was myself and our executive assistant. Sometimes there might be the EBP, and maybe there's an AVP on staff, or maybe there's the senior EA, and then maybe there's a PA. So you're starting to develop like this administrative team within the office of the CEO. Maybe it's a family office or that sort of thing. I'm also curious what you're seeing for titles when, and if it would be considered expert level, when there's like an admin team lead, somebody who's leading in a team of multiple EAs across an organization. Where does that individual fall, and maybe what are the titles for that role?
Oh man, that's a great question. Um, so if there's an admin team lead, so I've seen it, it depends on if the company is structured as a centralized or decentralized admin team. I actually did a presentation on this like a year ago. Um, if it's a centralized admin team where they have a dedicated administrative manager, the title can literally be administrative manager, it can be director of administration, it can be it totally depends. I don't I don't think that there is like a consistent or right or wrong way to do this. It depends on the size and the scope of your company and how you structure it. In some cases, I have seen where the senior executive assistant to the CEO, but is not a chief of staff, because again, going back to, you know, the administrative chiefs of staff, they're not the people who have MBAs that have worked in consulting for 5 years that then move into the role, right? So there's different types of chiefs of staff. So like in our example, where we're talking about chiefs of staff, we're really talking more about like administrative chiefs of staff, people who have grown up the ranks as an executive assistant, force multiplier, and then move into that chief of staff title. And then in a lot of cases, they end up getting that title of like administrative manager or director of administration. In some cases, they have a whole EA team under them. Some cases, they'll just have one EA under them as part of the office of the CEO. It totally depends. I don't know if I totally answered that question for you, but yeah, I would say like administrative manager, director of administration. Um, yeah, I would say those are probably the most common titles.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I feel like, and who knows, it'll change perhaps in 6 months as it becomes more
Yeah.
common. And, as again, these roles are continuing to change, and founders associate is becoming, I'm hearing that more
Oh,
often, which to me is
yeah,
very similar to like a chief of staff role,
yeah,
but there's all sorts of nuances there too. But I'm very into
yeah.
the founders associate role right now. So yeah.
Well, and executive operations is a pretty common title for somebody who's in more of this administrative chief of staff role. But they're doing a lot of like comms for their executive. They're running like the
Mhm.
operational cadences for their executive. So yeah, it totally just depends. Um, Now, Hallie, I wanted you to share a little bit more about this because this was something that you had in an article that you shared with me that I absolutely loved. And this is, again, kind of going to be these qualities of these expert force multipliers. And there were a couple of
Mhm.
things that you had in your in this article that you shared that I thought were really interesting beyond the like traditional like
Sure.
key qualities of like, you know, of being a great EA or chief of staff.
Yeah. So I mean, we talked about being a generalist. To me, that's a big piece of it. I would, maybe there are some roles where that's not completely necessary, but I even think about a lot of the executives or principals that we work with, like they are also in a way a generalist. They need to understand all of the, all of the functions of the business and how all of the pieces work together. And then that means that we do as well as force multipliers need to understand all of the different pieces of the business and be able to do a lot of different things. And so an expert force multiplier definitely is that adaptable, flexible generalist, broad scope of work. Um, we talked a bit about the being a driver. I always say they really, you want them to challenge your thinking. The higher an executive typically goes in an organization, or maybe we're talking about a celebrity, or a celebrity author or something like that, there's often not people around them who are telling them no, or who are, they may often have a lot of yes people around them. We'll just say that. And so I think it's our responsibility as a strategic partner and as an expert force multiplier to be the person who offers that distinct viewpoint, who does tell them professionally, of course, but tell them when something is not right or didn't land well with the team, or that there's or simply just challenging their thinking, maybe their thought process, they maybe missed a piece. Where can we bring that additional value to say, well, have you considered it from this angle? Or this is how it might be interpreted from this group of individuals at our organization. And it can be frustrating sometimes for your executives. I know Adam always said that to me, like that I would piss him off all of the time, but he said I loved that because it meant that it was hitting me viscerally enough that I knew I had to I had to check myself. And it doesn't mean I was always right, but it was at least entering into that dialogue where we were having those conversations as equal partners. And then the not being offended by the way you work, that one again, I guess is interesting, but when I work with founders and leaders and we're developing roles and we're talking about who's the right fit for them, um, as long as all things are ethical and legal and moral, I say you get to decide who you want to work with you and how you want to work. So if they don't want to talk about their weekends and they don't want to go out for team dinners and they don't want to, be inviting you over to their house, or whatever, all of these various things,
Mhm.
that's okay. But there's some EAs who really want a more personal relationship with their executive. And so that's fine too. You just need to make sure you find an executive. And conversely, like if I was working with an executive who wanted to have, go out to lunch and wanted to involve me in their family all of the time, I would have been like, this is probably not the right fit for me. I like to have a little bit more of the boundaries. Or I don't think I ever chatted with Adam about how his weekend was, because we were just like in it and in the business, and that's how we like to communicate. But I wasn't offended by that. And I think that it's important for our leaders to be very clear on who they are and what they want so that we can find the right match for that individual.
I want to underscore that. I think that's so important because when you're an EA looking to hire, these are conversations to have in the interview process. And conversely, with an executive, really think about that. I know that when I was an assistant over a decade ago, at one point I supported 7 different people because we were in between hiring and having somebody who got promoted. And I had most of my executives were like Adam, like you walk in the door, here's what's going on today, see you later, get out quick. And I had one executive who was like, how was your weekend? Da, 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 da. And I'm like, my preference isn't to do that, like, because I'm very directed too. But his assistant was like, all right, well, if he wants to chat about his weekend, I'll chat about his weekend. Right. And I didn't care. I was happy to do it. And I think that that's important to think about both as an executive and as an assistant of like, what works for you. And if you don't care, like I didn't care, and you're like, I'll work with any type of personality, then that's great. But if you know that that would absolutely drive you insane, you should be really clear about that and make sure you're digging into that in the interview process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about cultivating trust and transparency. And I know both of us, on your website, you have, I think, a free download people can do of what your 30, 60, 90-day plan was.
Yeah.
I know it's something that we help with, obviously, with our Hire for Attitude package. But from your perspective, like, what do you think is important here as far as like creating a formal 30, 60, 90-day plan?
Yeah, the things that I like to include are at the end, so that it's just a couple of things. It doesn't have to be a huge long list of things, but at the end of the 30 days, at the end of the 60 days, and at the end of the 90 days, you basically are looking at your new hire, you're looking at the role, and you're saying, are they hitting, did they win? Did they win in this 30 days? Is this somebody that I know is fulfilling the role, is growing, is learning, and is like ready to take on the next step? Did they accomplish the things that I need them to accomplish in 30 days? I know I'm like oversimplifying it, but basically it's like a litmus test. It's like a stop and go. Are they getting the green light to move on to that 60 days? And then at the 60 days, what did they do? Did they win? And are we giving them the green light to continue?
Yeah, we have, and we'll show it, but we won't go over it into detail, kind of what we think are like the most important things to happen in a 30, 60, 90-day. But then I think one of the things that is also really important, whenever I share with my clients in the first day, if not the first week, having that expectations conversation. And we have this document that's like questions to ask in your initial one-on-one, and it's all around expectations of the role, how you like to work, what drains you, what gives you energy. And I think having that expectations conversation is so important because this is a new partnership, it's a new relationship. This person needs to like intimately understand how you work.
Mhm.
And if you don't have that conversation, it's really going to be super hard for them to hit those, you know, guide like the things you want them to hit in the first 30, 60, 90 days if that information isn't given to them. Um,
Right.
and then let's talk a little bit about this like difference between like one-on-ones and syncs, because I think this is like a huge missed opportunity for
Yes.
people that are in these roles. So what are your perspective on the differences between one-on-ones versus syncs?
Yeah. So for me, the one-on-one is like it's a non-negotiable in my opinion between a leader and their force multiplier, anywhere from 30 minutes to 1 hour. In the beginning, it might be like an hour-long meeting, but eventually, once the relationship is built, it could be a 30-minute meeting. But for me, it's a non-negotiable, and it's not about sitting down and going through like a to-do list where you have all of your questions and you're trying to get them to answer them as quickly as possible so that you can actually do your work for the week. Um, it's actually for me, it was always a way to get into alignment on how my leader thinks, because the more I learn how they think and how they make decisions, the better force multiplier I can be. I always like to use it as an opportunity to get aligned on the company's goals, the initiatives, the high priority projects, see if any priorities have shifted or changed and where I can come in to help facilitate whatever those changes might be. And the final kind of piece of that is then just building the relationship. And I think it's the opportunity for me to give feedback to the leader, but the leader to also give feedback to me about what's working, what's not working, an opportunity for them to know where I want to go and grow in my career, and an opportunity for me to say, hey, this is what I'm doing. I took on this extra project. Here's an interesting article that I read. It's a way for me as the force multiplier to also have additional visibility in the role, because sometimes our EA roles aren't very highly visible. And so that's my opportunity to be visible to my leader and show what I'm doing and where I want to go in my career.
Mhm. And so you mentioned like roughly 30 minutes to an hour once a week. And that's where you're really thinking in the forward way. You're talking about strategy, you're bubbling up sort of, thoughts around priorities and strategy. And then as far
Hmm.
as syncs, I think
Yeah.
those syncs can happen live or asynchronously, and that's really where you go through that bulleted list. That's where
Yeah.
you as a force multiplier are expected to come prepared with, here's where I'm blocked and I need your help, and here's what I'm still working on, and like getting the answers to those questions. And I still think that those need to happen roughly on a day-to-day basis, but at least 2 to 3 times a week at a minimum in addition to that, to move things
Hmm.
forward. Because again, depending on how busy your business is, that just things are coming in at like a rapid speed and you need
Yeah.
answers on them. And sometimes those answers you can only get from your executive.
Yeah, absolutely. We did ours not necessarily in person all of the time. We did some that, by email often. That was how Adam liked to communicate. But that's why it's important to understand those communication channels, because one way or the other, I needed to sync up with him daily. And so it had to be a priority.
We included a quick thing, and we will share this DAC in our post webinar email for anybody who joins. So you will have this of like from our perspective, what we think should be covered and mastered in the first 30, 60, 90 days. But I really want to make sure we have enough time for you to talk about this concept of braving trust and like building that trust with an executive. And so, can you share a little bit more about this, Hallie?
Yeah, this is a great framework from Brene Brown. It's from her, I think she mentions it in two of her books. I first heard about it in her book, Dare to Lead. She mentions it again in Atlas of the Heart. Brene Brown's amazing. Go read all of her stuff. But this whole concept of braving trust, I think, is so relevant to the leader and force multiplier relationship. And so obviously braving, it's an acronym. So these are the words that spell braving. Boundaries, that's part of that initial expectations conversation. It's usually talked about in the hiring process. If you've never had a boundaries conversation with your leader and or your force multiplier, it's never too late to go back and have this conversation. Um, but for me, it's boundaries around how are we communicating? It's around what's our time in our schedules? When are we available? It's around what our comfort level is with various topics, because some people are more comfortable with some personal topics versus others. And really just what are you okay with? And then and then respecting those boundaries. That is how you cultivate trust. Reliability, of course, is saying doing what you say you're going to do. Are you a reliable person? When you are not reliable, of course, that can erode trust very quickly. Similarly to accountability, are you an accountable individual? Are you holding your other partner in this relationship accountable as well? But I think it again initially comes back to, are you an accountable individual? And when you are saying you're going to do things, do you do it? And do you hold yourself accountable as well? The vault is confidentiality in a nutshell. And being that vault for each other, that I think is the number one place that you can erode trust in an instant. And it is so difficult to get back if you're sharing something with your executive and they end up sharing it with somebody else in the team, or vice versa, and you're doing that somewhere in the organization. I think that's why it can be very lonely in both a leadership and a force multiplier position, because you know a lot of stuff and you can't say it and you can't share it with anybody. But that's kind of the nature of the beast, which was why it's so important to have that relationship with your leader, because sometimes they're the only individual that you can share this with, and they may only be able to share some of these things with you, and depending on the structure of the organization. Integrity, choosing what is right over what is easy. um I really like the non-judgment and the generosity part of this transparency and trust. Non-judgment is um coming from curiosity, and this is similar to the generosity, but coming from curiosity and not judgment when you're entering into discussions with your leader, or maybe they say we need to change something, and you're like, immediately you want to jump to judgment, but instead you got to just ask yourself, okay, well, why? What are they thinking? What other information might they know that I don't know? Um, and similarly with the generosity, that we often are judging ourselves on our intentions, but we are judging other people based on their actions. And so how do we actually uh, extend a more generous interpretation to each other when we're in conversations? And that also builds trust.
Absolutely. I love all of that. I think that vault piece is really important too, in that, um, you know, I think it's really hard both as a founder and a leader and also as a force multiplier to get answers. And I think that's where having like a third party, like an executive coach who is not part of the organization, that you can then go and ask for feedback. I know I've built a personally as a founder, like a whole network of other founders that I work with, where when I'm having like a challenge within my business, I know I can go to them and ask them for feedback. I think as an EA, as an administrative chief of staff, where can you go where you can get perspective from other people while, like, again, not having it be in the organization, obviously not divulging anything that be, considered confidential, but still getting an additional perspective, because you can't unfortunately talk about certain things within your company. And like both, I think both of these roles are equally lonely roles. Um, which is why having that partnership and being able to rely on each other is super important. No, I think this is fantastic. Okay, great. And then we did include here kind of at the end, and again, we're going to share this deck of just what successful leaders and force multipliers do for each other. We have, I think, 4 minutes left. There was a question that came in, if you're open to me asking it, Hallie, of
Yeah.
like, yeah, how can you create value for a team of C-suite execs that are not aligned? And that's really tough, especially if you're supporting multiple executives. So you're having to be sort of this
Mm.
partner to multiple people. So one person saying they fell on their sword multiple times to cover for the business partners, and it's been a challenge to say the least.
Yeah. Um, I don't know if I have great advice for that question. I've not never supported multiple um leaders, and I'm assuming that question is saying that the leaders are not aligned. Was that your interpretation of it? That
That's
they're not
my
necessarily,
interpretation. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, I as uncomfortable it is, I always say pretty much anything can be solved with a conversation. Now, is it easy? Absolutely not. But if we don't sometimes bring, I would say, you have to bring the issue to light. And I think that's part of the Fierce Conversations framework from Susan Scott, but they may not completely understand how misaligned that they are, and whether you bring that up to all of them, or if there's a senior leader in that environment that you need to go have that conversation with and bring that issue to light and say, here's what you don't have to say there's a problem necessarily, but just say, here's what I'm noticing, here's some of the potential issues that it's causing. I'd like to put this issue on the table, and can we discuss? Now, again, I'm way oversimplifying it. There's so many things that go into that. Um, but it often just starts with bringing the issue to light and having a conversation.
Yeah, I would agree. I think another thing that I learned just recently with one of our clients or friends that's a professional mediator is there's an exercise you can do called, getting clear, getting curious, and forgetting what the last piece is. But again, like facilitating that conversation of like, hey, I think like we don't seem to have alignment. I'm getting conflicting feedback or information from you guys. I'm not even sure if you're aware that I'm getting these conflicting directives. Can we sit down and like really get clear and curious about like what it is that you guys want? And maybe that's an individual conversation with everybody. Maybe that's a team meeting that you have with the executives to like facilitate and move these things forward. But I think that, I remember when I supported up to 7 people and I was getting conflicting information, and I would just send them an email and say, hey, here are all the things you guys have asked me to do. Here are the blockers that I see, are the ways that I can't get this done. Can you actually let me know what are the priorities? And so I can move forward. And then since they were all on that email, this was also like, over a decade ago, Slack didn't exist, or Teams, like this email is the only way to get hold of everybody. But I did that, and then they immediately were able to chime in and be like, oh, well, actually, this isn't a priority, or I don't really need you to do this, or like, you know what I mean? So I think any way that you can do it, whether ideally live is always best, but or asynchronously, I think to get everybody on board, they may not even be aware that they're being conflicting.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I think that that is 99% of the time it's that they just don't even know.
I agree. Well, this was so great, Hallie. We got a ton of amazing comments in the chat. I'm so thankful that you helped, co-develop this session with me today. Anything
Yeah,
else you'd
thank
like to
you.
add, or anything you'd like to share about the founder and force multiplier and your new role as CEO?
No, just if there, I mean, if anyone wants more information about what we're doing, head over to the website founderandforcemultiplier.com. The best place to kind of get connected is to join our newsletter, The Inner Circle, and then you'll stay up to date on everything and get new content every week.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much, Hallie. This was so great. I really appreciate you. And thanks
Thank
everybody
you
for
so
joining
much.
today. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.